The paralysis that struck Virginia Thornwood on October 12, 1853, sudden loss of all movement below her waist that transformed 32-year-old Heiress from active manager of Magnolia Grove Plantation into invalid, confined to rocking chair in her bedroom where she would spend remaining 23 years of her life, unable to walk, unable to stand, unable to escape physical and psychological prison that she and many others believed represented divine punishment or supernatural curse for specific act of cruelty that had occurred exactly 1 week earlier on October 5th when Virginia had sold 7-year-old child named Benjamin away from his dying mother Rachel, despite Rachel's desperate pleas that Virginia allow her final days with son, who was her only remaining family after Virginia had privy. Owsley sold Rachel's husband and 2 older children to different buyers, whose destinations Rachel never learned and whose fates remained unknown to her during final months of her life, as illness progressively destroyed her body, while emotional devastation of having lost entire family destroyed her spirit even before physical death occurred on October 8th, 3 days after Benjamin's sale and 4 days before Virginia's paralysis began. Subscribe now, smash that like button, and comment where you're watching from if you want to discover whether Virginia's paralysis was medical coincidence or supernatural justice, because what Rachel whispered with her dying breath will haunt you. The background establishing how Virginia Thornwood came to own Magnolia Grove and approximately 150 enslaved people whose labor generated wealth supporting her privileged lifestyle involved inheritance she received in 1848 when she was 27 years old, and when her father Nathaniel Thornwood died, leaving entire estate to his only surviving child, after Virginia's mother and 2 brothers had died during 1847 yellow fever epidemic that swept through Charleston, killing thousands of residents, including many members of South Carolina's planter elite, whose deaths created opportunities for heirs to inherit substantial properties, and whose deaths created massive disruption in slave markets as executors liquidated estates requiring sales of thousands of enslaved people, whose family structures were destroyed through distributions treating human beings as fungible property that could be divided among multiple heirs, or sold to generate cash that could be distributed more easily than land or other physical assets, whose values were subject to market fluctuations and whose management required expertise that many heirs lacked. Virginia's assumption of control over Magnolia Grove in 1848 involved her implementing management approach that differed dramatically from relatively paternalistic style her father had employed. Approach characterized by harsh discipline designed to maximize productivity through fear and through systematic cruelty that Virginia believed represented most efficient method for extracting labor from enslaved people whom she viewed with contempt, born from combination of racial prejudices common among white South Carolinians and personal bitterness resulting from her own disappointments, including failed engagement to Charleston merchant who had broken off relationship in 1846 when he learned that Virginia's dowry would be smaller than he had anticipated because Nathaniel had sustained financial losses during economic depression following Panic of 1837. The transformation from relatively privileged daughter, expecting comfortable marriage into unmarried woman managing plantation alone, created resentments that Virginia displaced onto enslaved workers at Magnolia Grove, who became targets for anger she could not direct toward white men, whose decisions had shaped her circumstances in ways she resented but could not openly challenge without violating social conventions governing white women's behavior. The specific policies Virginia implemented at Magnolia Grove beginning in 1848 included reducing food rations below levels that Nathaniel had provided, increasing work hours from dawn until full darkness during planting and harvest seasons, increasing frequency and severity of whippings for infractions real or imagined, and most significantly, implementing practice of selling enslaved workers who displeased her regardless of how such sales might separate families or might inflict emotional trauma on people being sold away from spouses, children, parents, or other relatives whose bonds slavery claimed to recognize through allowing enslaved people to form families, but whose bonds slavery systematically violated through treating family members as property that could be separated through sales whenever masters' economic interests or personal whims dictated such separations regardless of enslaved people's feelings or preferences about maintaining family unity. The reputation Virginia developed among enslaved workers at Magnolia Grove during 5 years from 1848 to 1853 was one of master, whose cruelty exceeded normal brutality, characterizing slavery generally. Reputation as person who seemed to derive satisfaction from inflicting suffering and from demonstrating her absolute power through arbitrary exercises of authority that kept enslaved workers constantly anxious about their security and constantly aware that any perceived slight or any failure to demonstrate sufficient deference could result in brutal punishment or could result in being sold away from community and family networks they had developed. At Magnolia Grove across years or across generations, for enslaved people whose families had been at plantation since Nathaniel's father had established operation during 1780s, when post-Revolutionary War economic opportunities attracted white settlers to South Carolina interior, where lands confiscated from loyalists or purchased from state governments were being developed for cotton cultivation using enslaved labor imported from Africa during decades before 1808, prohibition of international slave trade, or purchased from slave traders operating within domestic markets connecting Upper South regions like Virginia and Maryland, with Deep South regions like South Carolina, where expanding cotton cultivation created insatiable demand for workers whose labor would be extracted until death and then replaced through new purchases. The case of Rachel represented particularly egregious example of Virginia's systematic cruelty, though it was unfortunately typical of broader patterns characterizing her management of Magnolia Grove during years when her bitterness and her need to assert power over people who could not resist without risking death transformed her into figure of terror among enslaved population who understood that their mistress possessed not merely legal authoring tied to exploit them, but also psychological inclination towards sadism that made her more dangerous than masters who exploited enslaved people for economic purposes without deriving personal satisfaction from their suffering. Rachel had been born at Magnolia Grove in 1818, had married man named Samuel in 1835, through informal ceremony without legal recognition, that slavery denied, but that enslaved communities recognized as creating obligations between spouses and creating family structures that provided emotional support and provided sense of normalcy, despite systematic denial of enslaved people's humanity that characterized every aspect of slavery's operations. Rachel and Samuel had 3 children together: Moses, born 1836, Miriam, born 1839, and Benjamin, born 1846, just months before yellow fever epidemic that would kill Virginia's family and would set in motion series of events leading to Samuel and 2 older children being sold away in 1849 during Virginia's consolidation of control over Magnolia Grove, when she had decided to sell approximately 30 enslaved workers whom she considered troublesome or unproductive. Decision that generated immediate cash, helping stabilize plantation's finances, following expenses associated with Nathaniel's death and associated with Virginia establishing her authority as plantation's owner. But that destroyed families, including Rachel's family, whose members were scattered across South Carolina and Georgia, through sales to different buyers, whose destinations Rachel learned only through fragments of information, that slave trade. Jazz sometimes provided, and through rumors circulating through enslaved communities' communication networks that transmitted information across plantation boundaries, despite white attempts to control all information flows. The separation from Samuel and from Moses and Miriam had devastated Rachel psychologically and had contributed to physical decline that began almost immediately after their sales in February 1849, when Rachel's health started deteriorating through combination of grief-induced depression affecting her appetite and her sleep, and through what modern medicine would recognize as stress-induced suppression of immune system, making her vulnerable to infections and making her vulnerable to progression of chronic conditions that healthy immune system might have kept under control. The specific illness that ultimately killed Rachel was never definitively diagnosed by plantation physician whose medical knowledge reflected limitations of 1850s medicine and whose interest in accurately diagnosing enslaved people's illnesses was minimal because economic calculations meant that spending time and resources on medical care for enslaved workers was justified only when workers' economic value exceeded costs of treatment. Calculations that meant chronically ill enslaved people often received minimal medical attention because their reduced productivity made them less valuable as property and made investing in their health care economically irrational from masters' perspectives, even though such calculations represented moral obscenity, treating human beings as mere units of production whose worth was measured entirely through their capacity to generate profits. The progression of Rachel's illness across 4 years from 1849 through 1853 involved gradual but relentless decline, punctuated by acute episodes where her symptoms would intensify to point of incapacitating her temporarily before partially resolving, allowing her to return to reduced work capacity that Virginia grudgingly tolerated, because completely removing Rachel from productive labor would have meant losing entirely whatever economic value, say, he still possessed despite her declining health. The symptoms Rachel experienced, persistent cough, progressive weight loss despite adequate food intake when she could eat at all, night sweats, increasing weakness making physical labor progressively more difficult, suggested tuberculosis as most likely diagnosis, though other chronic illnesses could have produced similar presentations, and though definitive diagnosis was impossible without diagnostic technologies that would not be developed until decades later. The tuberculosis that likely killed Rachel was endemic in enslaved communities where crowded living conditions, inadequate nutrition, systematic overwork producing chronic exhaustion, and lack of adequate medical care created perfect conditions for disease transmission and created conditions where infected people's immune systems could not effectively fight infections that healthy people might have controlled or eliminated before diseases progressed to fatal stages. The final months of Rachel's life during summer and early fall of 1853 involved her becoming progressively weaker until she could no longer perform any useful work, deterioration that created crisis for Virginia, who had to decide whether to continue supporting Rachel through providing food and minimal care, or whether to rid herself of economic burden that Rachel represented by selling her, despite her obviously declining health. That would make finding buyer difficult, and that would likely result in Rachel being sold to slave trader, specializing in purchasing elderly, injured, or sick enslaved people at extremely discounted prices and reselling them to buyers who would extract whatever final labor such workers could provide before dying, practice that represented some of slavery's most brutal aspects, because it involved treating human beings as completely disposable resources, whose final suffering was irrelevant, as long as some marginal economic value could be extracted before death occurred. Virginia's decision not to sell dying Rachel, but rather to sell 7-year-old Benjamin, who was healthy and who would command good price because children Benjamin's age represented long-term investments whose productive capacity would extend across decades if they survived childhood diseases and if they received adequate nutrition and adequate care to reach adulthood when their labor would generate maximum returns on initial purchase prices. This decision represented calculated cruelty, whose motivation involved not merely economic rationality, but deliberate choice to inflict maximum possible suffering on Rachel through taking from her only remaining family member during her final weeks of life, when Benjamin's presence represented Rachel's only source of comfort and represented only connection to family that Virginia's previous sales had destroyed. The specific timing of sale occurring on October 5, 1853, when Rachel's physician had informed Virginia that Rachel would likely die within days or at most within weeks, created circumstances where Virginia knew that Benjamin's sale would mean Rachel would die knowing her son had been taken from her, and would die without any family present to provide comfort during her final suffering. The scene that occurred on morning of October 5, 1853, when Virginia ordered overseer named Jacob Morrison to prepare Benjamin for sale to trader, who would arrive that afternoon to collect child and to pay agreed-upon price of $450 as representing fair market value for healthy 7-year-old boy whose future productive capacity extended across decades if he survived childhood diseases and if he received adequate nutrition, allowing him to reach adulthood when his labor would generate maximum returns. The scene represented culmination of Virginia's calculated cruelty toward Rachel, whose suffering Virginia appeared to view not as unfortunate consequence of necessary economic decision, but rather as desired outcome that Virginia deliberately engineered through timing Benjamin's sale to occur during Rachel's final days, when emotional devastation would compound physical suffering that tuberculosis was already inflicting on woman whose body was being destroyed from within. while emotional trauma of losing entire family was destroying her psychologically in ways that physical disease alone could never have accomplished, regardless of how painful symptoms might become during terminal stages of illness. The confrontation between Rachel and Virginia that occurred when Rachel learned Benjamin would be sold that day involved Rachel dragging herself from sickbed, where she had been confined during previous weeks, as her condition deteriorated to point where even minimal physical activity left her exhausted and breathless, involved her making her way to Main House, where Virginia conducted plantation business and where Virginia maintained office containing records documenting every aspect of Magnolia Grove's operations, including detailed ledgers tracking enslaved workers' births, deaths, purchases, sales, work assignments, productivity measurements, disciplinary incidents, and medical treatments, whose costs were carefully calculated to ensure that expenditures on maintaining enslaved workers' health did not exceed economic value, that those workers' continued productivity would generate for plantation owner whose primary obligation was maximizing profits rather than protecting human welfare of people whose legal status as property meant they possessed no rights that property owners were bound to respect, according to legal doctrines that courts throughout slaveholding South consistently reinforced through rulings, prioritizing masters' property rights over any competing claims based on enslaved people's humanity or based on moral considerations about justice or compassion that legal systems insisted were irrelevant when determining how masters could treat property they legally owned. The plea that Rachel made to Virginia represented desperate mother's final attempt to secure even temporary reprieve for son, whose presence during her final days represented only comfort available to woman who had lost husband and two older children through Virginia's previous sales, and who faced dying alone without any family members present to provide companionship or to perform final rituals that communities typically provided for dying members. Regardless of how humble those members' social positions might be, Rachel's words, spoken haltingly between coughing fits that brought up blood, indicating that tuberculosis had progressed to stage where lung tissue was being destroyed and where death would likely occur within days rather than weeks, begged Virginia to allow Benjamin to remain at Magnolia Grove at least until after Rachel's death, begged Virginia to show mercy that Rachel insisted every human being deserved, regardless of their legal status or racial classification, begged Virginia to recognize that separating dying mother from her only remaining child represented cruelty that exceeded even slavery's normal brutality, and that represented violation of basic human decency that Rachel believed even white mistress should be capable of recognizing despite racial prejudices and despite economic interests that might otherwise justify selling valuable property whose continued presence at plantation served no productive purpose once mother who loved him was dead. Virginia's response to Rachel's plea demonstrated coldness that shocked even Overseer Jacob Morrison, who had witnessed considerable brutality during 20 years working on various South Carolina plantations, but who had never encountered master or mistress who appeared to derive active satisfaction from inflicting emotional suffering beyond what economic rationality or disciplinary requirements might justify. Virginia told Rachel that Benjamin's sale had already been arranged and would proceed as scheduled, told Rachel that her feelings about separation from her son were irrelevant because enslaved people's emotional attachments possessed no legal significance and deserved no moral consideration from masters whose authority extended to making all decisions about property management without requiring justification or explanation to people who were themselves property rather than persons deserving respect or deserving recognition of their humanity, told Rachel that if she had wanted to keep her family together, she should have worked harder and should have avoided displeasing her mistress through attitudes or behaviors that Virginia interpreted as insufficiently deferential or insufficiently submissive to white authority, that slavery required enslaved people to accept without question, regardless of how arbitrary or how cruel that authority's exercise might be. The curse that Rachel pronounced in response to Virginia's refusal represented act of resistance available to person who possessed no legal recourse and no physical capacity to prevent separation that Virginia had ordered, but who retained spiritual resources drawn from African religious traditions that had survived Middle Passage, despite systematic attempts to destroy all cultural practices connecting enslaved people to ancestral homelands and cosmological frameworks, providing alternatives to Christian theology that slaveholders promoted as justifying racial hierarchy and as teaching enslaved people that submission to earthly masters represented divine commandment whose violation would result in eternal damnation. Rachel's curse, spoken in mixture of English and fragments of African language that her grandmother had taught her before dying when Rachel was child, invoked ancestral spirits and invoked divine justice to punish Virginia for crimes that human legal systems refused to recognize as crimes because those legal systems treated enslaved people as property whose suffering generated no legal consequences for masters who inflicted that suffering regardless of how extreme that suffering might be, or how unnecessary from perspective of maximizing profits or maintaining discipline that slavery required for its continued operation. The specific words Rachel spoke, according to witnesses who heard confrontation, included declaration that Virginia would never walk again after Benjamin was taken from her, declaration that Virginia would spend rest of her life confined like prisoner, unable to escape physical cage, that her body would become just as Rachel had been confined in cage that slavery imposed on all enslaved people whose movements were controlled and whose choices were eliminated through system that reduced them to status of property lacking agency or lacking capacity to determine even basic aspects of their own existence. Rachel declared that Virginia's legs would fail her, and that she would spend years sitting immobile while her body slowly deteriorated around consciousness that remained trapped inside flesh that no longer responded to her will, declared that this paralysis would represent justice for crimes Virginia had committed through separating Rachel from her family and through selling Benjamin away from dying mother, who deserved at minimum to spend her final days with her only remaining child. Regardless of what economic considerations or what personal animosity Virginia felt toward enslaved woman who had never harmed her, but who had been targeted for extraordinary cruelty that exceeded even slavery's normal brutality. The reaction that Virginia displayed to Rachel's curse involved dismissive laughter and scornful statements about superstitious nonsense that ignorant enslaved people believed because they lacked education and lacked rational understanding of how world actually operated according to natural laws rather than according to supernatural forces that educated white people understood represented merely primitive attempts to explain phenomena whose actual causes remained mysterious to people lacking scientific knowledge. Virginia told Rachel that curses possessed no power beyond psychological effects on people foolish enough to believe in them, told Rachel that she would walk perfectly well after Benjamin's sale, just as she had walked perfectly well before that sale, and told Rachel that if she wanted to waste her final breaths pronouncing meaningless curses rather than preparing her soul for death through Christian prayer, then that represented Rachel's choice, but that such choice merely confirmed Virginia's contempt for enslaved people whose supposed inferiority justified their continued subjugation despite abolitionists' arguments about universal human rights that Virginia considered dangerous nonsense threatening to destroy social order that slavery maintained through keeping inferior races under control of superior white people whose authority derived from God and from nature rather than from mere human conventions that could be challenged or changed through political agitation. The sale that proceeded that afternoon, despite Rachel's plea and despite Rachel's curse, involved slave trader named Cornelius Webb arriving at Magnolia Grove with cash payment and with transportation arranged to take Benjamin to Charleston, where he would be held briefly before being transported to Buyer in Mississippi, who had ordered several young enslaved children whose labor would be employed initially in domestic service before transitioning to field work as they matured into adolescence and adulthood, when their physical capabilities would make them suitable for agricultural labor that generated primary profits in cotton cultivation, dominating Mississippi's economy and dominating economic calculations throughout Deep South, where expanding cotton production created insatiable demand for enslaved workers whose numbers had to be constantly replenished through domestic slave trade, because immortality rates in cotton-growing regions remained high enough that natural population increase among enslaved people proved insufficient to meet labor demands that plantation expansion continually generated. The separation of Benjamin from Rachel occurred with brutal efficiency, characteristic of slavery's operations, where emotional bonds between family members were treated as obstacles to overcome rather than as relationships deserving protection or deserving consideration when economic decisions were being made about property disposals. Benjamin was taken from Rachel's cabin, where he had been staying during her final illness, was placed in wagon without being allowed to say goodbye to his mother, who remained too weak to leave her bed, and who therefore could only listen to sounds of her son crying and calling for her, as wagon departed, carrying him away from only home he had ever known, and away from mother, he would never see again, because Rachel would die 3 days later on October 8th, without having received any information about where Benjamin had been taken, or about what conditions he would face in Mississippi, where life expectancy for enslaved workers remained shorter than in Upper South regions, where less brutal climate and less intensive agricultural practices allowed enslaved people to survive longer on average, though survival anywhere within slavery meant enduring systematic exploitation and systematic denial of humanity that characterized institution whose fundamental nature involved treating people as property regardless of how supposedly humane individual masters might claim to be in their personal management practices. The death that came to Rachel on October 8th, 1853, 3 days after Benjamin's sale and 4 days before Virginia's paralysis began, occurred with several enslaved women present who had maintained vigil during Rachel's final hours, despite knowing that time spent attending dying woman represented time when they would not be performing productive labor, and therefore represented time that Virginia might punish them for once Rachel was dead and could no longer benefit from their presence. The women who attended Rachel's death reported that her final words before losing consciousness permanently involved repeating curse she had pronounced against Virginia 3 days earlier, involved declaring that justice would come for woman who had inflicted such unnecessary cruelty on dying mother, and involved expressing hope that Benjamin might somehow survive separation and might somehow eventually achieve freedom that Rachel herself had never experienced during 35 years of enslavement, during which she had been born into bondage, had lived entire life as property owned by people who viewed her as less than human, and was dying, knowing that son she had brought into world would inherit same condition of perpetual subjugation unless circumstances changed in ways that Rachel could not predict, but that she prayed might somehow occur, despite her recognition that slavery's power appeared overwhelming and appeared likely to continue indefinitely, regardless of abolitionists' moral arguments or enslaved people's resistance strategies, whose effectiveness remained limited by enormous disparities in power between masters who controlled legal systems and military forces, and enslaved people whose resistance required operating through indirect methods, because direct confrontation inevitably resulted in brutal suppression, demonstrating slavery's capacity for extreme violence when its existence appeared threatened. The funeral that was held for Rachel on October 9th involved brief ceremony conducted by enslaved preacher who led religious services for Magnolia Grove's black community using Christianity that had been adapted to incorporate African spiritual elements and to emphasize themes of liberation and divine justice that resonated with enslaved people's experiences, even though white Christianity, as promoted by slaveholders, emphasized submission and obedience to earthly masters, as representing God's will for enslaved people whose suffering in this life would supposedly be compensated through rewards in afterlife if they accepted their bondage without resistance. The burial occurred in small cemetery located at edge of Magnolia Grove's property, where enslaved people who had died at plantation across several generations were interred in unmarked graves, whose locations were remembered through oral traditions maintained within community, but whose physical markers were minimal or non-existent, because providing elaborate grave markers for enslaved people would have implied that their lives possessed significance, so that slavery's logic insisted they lacked as property, whose value derived entirely from their labor capacity, and whose deaths represented merely economic losses, requiring replacement through new purchases, rather than representing occasions for mourning or for memorializing individuals whose humanity slavery systematically denied. The paralysis that struck Virginia Thornwood on October 12, 1853, exactly 1 week after Benjamin's sale and 4 days after Rachel's death, began with tingling sensation in her legs that Virginia initially dismissed as temporary discomfort resulting from having sat too long in uncomfortable position while reviewing plantation accounts. But tingling rapidly progressed to numbness that spread from her feet upward through her calves and thighs, progressed to complete loss of sensation below her waist, and finally progressed to complete loss of motor control, meaning that Virginia could no longer move her legs or could no longer stand or walk, regardless of how much effort she exerted, trying to force her body to respond to commands that her brain issued, but that her paralyzed limbs could no longer execute. The progression from initial symptoms to complete paralysis occurred over approximately 6 hours during afternoon and evening of October 12th, occurred rapidly enough that Virginia recognized something seriously wrong was happening, but occurred gradually enough that she experienced terror of watching her body progressively fail as sensation and control disappeared from lower half of her body, leaving her conscious and aware but unable to move in ways that she had taken for granted throughout her life, until moment when that capacity suddenly vanished without warning and without obvious external cause that physicians examining her could identify through diagnostic methods available in 1853. Subscribe and comment whether you think Rachel's curse caused Virginia's paralysis or whether medical coincidence gets too much credit because enslaved witnesses insisted they saw supernatural justice delivered exactly as promised. The medical examinations that Virginia underwent during weeks following onset of paralysis on October 12, 1853, involved consultations with multiple physicians, including Dr. Marcus Whitfield, who served as Magnolia Grove's regular physician, treating enslaved workers' illnesses and treating Virginia's family during 30 years practicing medicine in region, and including specialists summoned from Charleston, whose expertise supposedly exceeded that of rural practitioners like Dr. Whitfield, but whose diagnostic capabilities remained limited by medical knowledge available in 1853, when understanding of neurological conditions remained rudimentary, and when most paralysis cases could not be explained through mechanisms that physicians understood sufficiently to develop effective treatments beyond symptomatic management, providing comfort without addressing underlying causes of patients' symptoms. The examinations involved physicians testing Virginia's reflexes through various stimuli applied to her paralyzed legs, involved them attempting to identify areas where sensation remained intact versus areas where complete numbness indicated nerve damage or dysfunction, involved them questioning Virginia extensively about symptoms she experienced or failed to experience, including whether she felt pain in affected areas or whether numbness represented complete absence of all sensation, including pain that might indicate ongoing nerve damage versus mere loss of motor control that might suggest different underlying pathology. The diagnosis that physicians eventually settled upon, after weeks of inconclusive examinations failing to identify definitive cause for Virginia's paralysis, involved concluding that she suffered from hysterical paralysis, representing psychological condition rather than physical neurological damage, diagnosis reflecting common medical belief during 19th century that women's bodies and women's minds were particularly susceptible to nervous disorders producing physical symptoms without organic causes that anatomical examination or physiological testing could identify. The concept of hysteria as medical diagnosis encompassed wide range of symptoms that physicians attributed to women's supposedly fragile constitutions and supposedly unstable emotional states, making them vulnerable to disorders that men supposedly did not experience, because men's rationality and men's emotional stability protected them against nervous breakdowns that women's inferior mental and physical capacities made them susceptible to accord. Cast to medical theories, reflecting broader cultural beliefs about gender differences and about women's essential weakness, requiring male protection and male control to prevent women from succumbing to various physical and psychological ailments that their nature predisposed them toward. The treatment that physicians recommended for Virginia's hysterical paralysis involved rest, avoidance of mental and physical exertion that might exacerbate nervous condition, administration of various tonics and sedatives whose active ingredients included opium and alcohol, whose effects provided temporary relief from anxiety but did nothing to address underlying causes of paralysis, if such causes actually existed beyond psychological factors that physicians believed were producing symptoms, and most controversially involved physicians, suggesting that Virginia's unmarried status and her lack of children represented contributing factors to her nervous breakdown, because women's bodies were supposedly designed for marriage and motherhood, and women who remained unmarried past prime childbearing years supposedly suffered various physical and psychological consequences resulting from unfulfilled biological destinies that nature intended if or all women, regardless of individual circumstances or preferences, that might make marriage unattractive or impossible. The implication that Virginia's paralysis resulted from her failure to marry and her failure to bear children added psychological burden to physical suffering she already experienced, added sense of personal failure to medical crisis that was destroying her independence and was transforming her from active plantation manager into invalid, requiring constant care from servants whose labor she could no longer supervise directly from her bedroom, where she would spend remaining 23 years of her life. The reaction among enslaved people at Magnolia Grove to Virginia's paralysis involved widespread belief that Rachel's curse had produced desired effect exactly as Rachel had pronounced it would occur, belief that divine or supernatural justice had intervened to punish Virginia for crime, that human legal systems refused to recognize as crime because selling enslaved child away from dying mother represented perfectly legal exercise of property rights that masters possessed under South Carolina law, regardless of how cruel such exercise might appear to observers whose moral sensibilities were not completely deadened by exposure to slavery's rooty brutalities. The testimony that enslaved witnesses provided to each other, testimony that would eventually be preserved through oral traditions and would eventually be recorded during 1930s when formerly enslaved people were interviewed about their experiences during slavery, emphasized that paralysis had struck Virginia exactly 1 week after Benjamin's sale and exactly 4 days after Rachel's death, emphasized that timing suggested causal connection rather than mere coincidence, emphasized that Rachel's final words pronouncing curse had possessed power that white rationality denied, but that African spiritual traditions recognized as real force capable of affecting physical reality through mechanisms transcending material causation that European scientific frameworks insisted represented only valid forms of causation worthy of serious consideration. The debate among historians examining Virginia's case involves fundamental questions about whether supernatural explanations for her paralysis deserve consideration or whether modern medical knowledge provides adequate naturalistic explanations, making supernatural causation unnecessary hypothesis whose invocation merely reflects historical actors' ignorance about actual mechanisms producing symptoms they attributed to curses or divine interventi. The argument favoring naturalistic explanation emphasizes that psychosomatic paralysis represents well-documented phenomenon where psychological trauma or extreme stress can produce genuine physical symptoms, including paralysis that patients cannot overcome through willpower alone, despite symptoms lacking identifiable organic causes that anatomical examination or neurological testing can detect. Emphasizes that guilt about Benjamin's sale combined with fear generated by Rachel's curse could have produced psychological conditions sufficient to trigger conversion disorder, where unconscious psychological conflicts manifest as physical symptoms, providing escape from intolerable emotional states that conscious mind cannot process without experiencing psychological breakdown. The argument favoring supernatural explanation emphasizes that dismissing enslaved people's spiritual beliefs as mere superstition represents form of cultural imperialism, privileging European rationality over African knowledge systems that possess their own internal logic and their own empirical validation through generations of experience, demonstrating that curses and spiritual interventions produce observable effects that rationalist framework says struggle to explain adequately through alternative mechanisms. The practical impact of Virginia's paralysis on Magnolia Grove's operations involved necessity of appointing overseer to assume management responsibilities that Virginia could no longer fulfill from bedroom, where she remained confined throughout remaining years of her life, involved Jacob Morrison being promoted from assistant overseer to head overseer, with authority to make day-to-day decisions about plantation operations, while major decisions about property sales or major capital investments required consultation with Virginia, despite difficulty of such consultations, given her physical limitations and given her increasing psychological deterioration, as isolation and helplessness took psychological toll that science treatments could not alleviate. The change in management created opportunities for enslaved workers at Magnolia Grove to negotiate better treatment because Jacob lacked Virginia's vindictiveness and lacked her apparent satisfaction in inflicting suffering, opportunities that manifested in reduced frequency of whippings for minor infractions, in improved food rations that Jacob authorized without consulting Virginia, because he recognized that adequately fed workers produced more efficiently than hungry workers whose physical capacity was compromised by malnutrition, and in reduced frequency of family separations through sales, because Jacob understood that maintaining family units contributed to plantation stability and contributed to workers' psychological well-being in ways that improved their productivity and reduced their inclination toward resistance strategies, including running away or engaging in work slowdowns or sabotage that angry or desperate workers employed when they believed they had nothing to lose through such resistance. The years Virginia spent confined to rocking chair in her bedroom from 1853 until her death in 1876 involved progressive physical deterioration as muscles atrophied from disuse and as complications, including bed sores from constant sitting and urinary tract infections from reduced mobility, created chronic health problems, compounding original paralysis that had triggered her decline. But physical deterioration was accompanied by psychological transformation, involving Virginia developing increasing obsession with Rachel's curse and developing conviction that paralysis represented punishment for crimes she had committed, not merely through selling Benjamin away from dying Rachel, but more broadly through 5 years of cruel management at Magnolia Grove, during which she had inflicted systematic suffering on enslaved workers whose humanity she had refused to acknowledge and whose families she had destroyed through sales, motivated by economic calculations or by personal vindictiveness, rather than by any legitimate managerial necessity or by any moral considerations about justice or compassion that Virginia had dismissed as irrelevant sentimentality that weak people allowed to interfere with rational pursuit of profits and rational exercise of authority that slavery granted. Masters over property they owned, the confession that Virginia made to Minister, who visited her regularly during final years of her life, involved her acknowledging that selling Benjamin had been unnecessary from economic perspective because Benjamin's value as property was minimal compared to Virginia's total wealth, and because keeping him at Magnolia Grove until Rachel's death would have cost Virginia virtually nothing while providing dying mother with comfort that represented her only remaining desire during final days of life that Virginia's cruelty had made even more agonizing than illness alone would have made them. Virginia told Minister that she had sold Benjamin specifically to inflict maximum possible suffering on Rachel, told Minister that she had derived satisfaction from Rachel's anguish and from Rachel's helplessness to prevent separation that Virginia ordered, told Minister that only after paralysis struck did she begin recognizing that satisfaction she had felt represented moral depravity rather than representing legitimate exercise of authority that masters possessed over enslaved people whose feelings Virginia had believed deserved no consideration because enslaved people's legal status as property meant their emotional lives possessed no significance that white people were bound to respect. The question of whether Virginia's belated recognition of her cruelty represented genuine moral transformation or represented merely self-serving attempt to secure salvation through deathbed repentance remained contested among people who knew about her confession, remained subject to different interpretations depending on whether observers emphasized her apparent sincere remorse or emphasized that such remorse came too late to benefit Rachel or Benjamin or other enslaved people whose lives Virginia had destroyed through her cruelty during years when she possessed power to act differently, but chose instead to inflict unnecessary suffering that exceeded even slavery's normal brutality. The letter Virginia wrote to Minister, requesting that after her death he attempt to locate Benjamin and inform him about inheritance. Virginia was leaving him represented attempt at restitution, acknowledging that nothing could restore childhood Benjamin had lost or could compensate him for separation from mother whose death occurred without his presence to provide comfort or to say goodbye. But Virginia hoped that substantial financial bequest might at least provide Benjamin with resources, allowing him to purchase his freedom if he remained enslaved, or allowing him to establish independent life if by chance he had somehow achieved freedom through circumstances Virginia could not predict. The death that came to Virginia on March 15, 1876, occurred after 23 years of paralysis, during which she had remained confined to bedroom, where rocking chair that had become permanent prison represented daily reminder of curse Rachel had pronounced and represented daily reminder of crimes Virginia had committed through treating enslaved people with cruelty, exceeding what even slavery's brutal logic required for extracting profitable labor from workers whose resistance had to be prevented. Through combination of incentives and punishments calibrated to maintain productivity without destroying workers so completely that their economic value was eliminated through death or through permanent psychological or physical damage, making them unsuitable for continued exploitation. The funeral that followed Virginia's death was attended by a small number of white people from surrounding plantations who had maintained social connections with Thornwood family despite Virginia's reputation and despite scandals involving her paralysis and involving rumors about curse that many white people dismissed as superstitious nonsense, but that some privately wondered whether might contain truth that rationalist frameworks could not adequately explain or adequately dismiss. The will that Virginia left included provision leaving $5,000 to Benjamin if he could be located and if he survived until Virginia's death. Provision that represented extraordinary bequest, considering that most enslaved people received nothing from masters who had exploited their labor throughout their lives, and considering that Virginia's white relatives challenged provision through arguing that enslaved person or formerly enslaved person did not deserve receiving inheritance from white woman whose wealth had been accumulated through exploitation of enslaved labor and through inheritance from father whose wealth similarly derived from slavery system that Virginia's relatives wanted to perpetuate, rather than to undermine, through making bequests to black people that might establish precedents challenging racial hierarchies requiring black people to remain economically subordinate to white people, regardless of what individual white people might specify in their wills about their desires to provide restitution or compensation to people they had wronged. The search for Benjamin that Virginia's executor conducted following her death in 1876 involved attempting to trace his movements from 1853 sale through various subsequent sales and locations where he might have lived or might have died during 23 years since separation from Rachel, search that proved largely unsuccessful because records documenting enslaved people's lives remained minimal and because Civil War's disruption of South Carolina society had destroyed many documents that might have provided information about Benjamin's fate. The limited information executor eventually obtained suggested that Benjamin had been sold from Mississippi to Alabama around 1858, had possibly survived until emancipation in 1865, and had possibly remained in Alabama during Reconstruction, though no definitive proof could be obtained, confirming whether person identified in fragmentary records as Benjamin, who had been born around 1846, actually represented same Benjamin who had been sold from Magnolia Grove in 1853, or represented different person who happened to share same name and approximate age. The eventual discovery in 1922 of man named Benjamin Carter living in Birmingham, Alabama, who had been born around 1846 and who possessed childhood memories of being separated from his mother at plantation in South Carolina, occurred not through efforts of Virginia's executor, whose 1876 search had proven unsuccessful, but rather through entirely coincidental encounter when Benjamin's granddaughter mentioned family oral traditions about ancestor who had been sold away from dying mother during slavery to researcher collecting narratives from formerly enslaved people and from their descendants whose stories were being systematically documented during 1920s and 1930s when remaining survivors of slavery were reaching old age, and when historians recognized that within few decades all living witnesses to slavery would be dead and their testimonies would be lost forever if not recorded, while memories remained accessible through direct interviews or through second-hand accounts from children and grandchildren who had heard stories from people who had experienced slavery directly. The interview that researcher conducted with Benjamin Carter in 1922, when Benjamin was approximately 76 years old and his memories of childhood events had been shaped by 70 years of reflection and by countless retellings to family members whose interpretations of events might have influenced how Benjamin himself remembered and understood experiences whose original meanings had been filtered through adult consciousness trying to make sense of childhood trauma, provided detailed account of separation from his mother Rachel, and provided Benjamin's perspective on events that had occurred when he was 7 years old and had possessed limited capacity to understand why he was being taken from his mother, or where he was being transported, or what his future would involve in Mississippi, where he had been sold. The account Benjamin provided emphasized memory of his mother crying and reaching toward him as he was placed in wagon that would transport him to Charleston, emphasized memory of her telling him to be strong and to remember her, and to remember that she loved him despite separation that neither of them could prevent, emphasized memory of his confusion about why separation was occurring and his belief that somehow he must have done something wrong to deserve being sent away from only home he had ever known and from only family he had ever known. The subsequent years in Mississippi involved Benjamin being worked initially as domestic servant before transitioning to field labor as he grew older and as his physical capabilities developed sufficiently to make him valuable as agricultural worker rather than as house servant, whose primary value derived from performing light domestic tasks rather than from performing heavy physical labor that field cultivation required. The trauma of separation from Rachel and the uncertainty about what had happened to her, whether she had survived or whether she had died, whether she had eventually been sold to different plantation or whether she had remained at Magnolia Grove, whether she had ever received any information about his whereabouts or his welfare, or whether she had died, without knowing whether he had survived journey to Mississippi or had died during first years in unfamiliar environment where diseases and brutal treatment killed many newly arrived enslaved children whose bodies could not adapt quickly enough to new conditions. This trauma and this uncertainty had shaped Benjamin's entire life, even after AC. Heaving freedom through emancipation in 1865, and even after establishing stable life in Birmingham, where he had worked as carpenter and had raised family, whose 8 children and numerous grandchildren represented continuation of family line that separation from Rachel had threatened to extinguish. The information Benjamin provided about his mother Rachel included details about her illness during his final weeks at Magnolia Grove, included his memory of her coughing blood and being unable to leave bed during days before his sale, included his memory of her desperate plea to Mistress Virginia asking that Benjamin be allowed to remain with her at least until she died, included his memory of Virginia's cold refusal and Virginia's statement that Rachel's feelings about keeping her son were irrelevant because enslaved people's emotional attachments possessed no significance that masters were bound to respect. The detail that Benjamin remembered most vividly 70 years after events occurred involved his mother's final words to him before wagon departed carrying him away. She had told him that mistress who sold him would be punished for her cruelty, had told him that divine justice would ensure that unnecessary suffering Virginia had inflicted on dying mother and on her child would not go unanswered, had told him to maintain hope that despite separation, they would be reunited either in this life if circumstances allowed, or in afterlife where slavery's divisions would be overcome and where families would be restored to wholeness that earthly existence under slavery had denied them. The revelation to Benjamin's family in 1923, when researcher returned with information about Virginia's will and about bequest leaving $5 as $0 to Benjamin, if he could be located, involved mixture of emotions including satisfaction that Virginia had apparently experienced remorse about her cruelty and had attempted to make restitution through financial provision, anger that such attempted restitution came decades too late to benefit Benjamin during his most difficult years establishing himself after emancipation when $5,000 would have represented transformative amount of capital, allowing him to purchase property and to establish business, rather than merely surviving through wage labor, whose compensation barely covered basic necessities, and curiosity about whether legal mechanisms existed for Benjamin to claim inheritance, despite 50 years having passed since Virginia's death, and despite substantial legal obstacles likely confronting claims by black man against white family whose relatives had contested original bequest, and whose descendants might contest any renewed attempt to enforce provision that courts had never definitively ruled upon because Benjamin's whereabouts had been unknown during litigation period. The legal consultation Benjamin pursued following researchers' revelation confirmed that claiming inheritance after nearly 50 years presented insurmountable obstacles, including statutes of limitations that barred claims filed decades after they should have been initiated, including destruction of relevant documents during intervening years, making proof of Benjamin's identity extraordinarily difficult, and including racial discrimination within legal systems, making successful prosecution of claims by black plaintiffs against white defendants extremely unlikely, regardless of legal merits, because courts throughout South systematically ruled against black litigants in cases involving property or money that white people claimed interests in. The decision Benjamin ultimately made involved not pursuing legal claim despite moral validity of his entitlement to inheritance that Virginia had explicitly designated for him, decision reflecting pragmatic recognition that costs of litigation would likely exceed any recovery he might obtain, and reflecting recognition that at 77 years old, he lacked time or energy necessary for protracted legal battles whose outcomes remained uncertain despite apparent strength of his legal position, if documents supporting his claims could be located and authenticated. The broader significance of Benjamin's story within historical understanding of slavery's impact on families involves recognizing that separation trauma affected not merely people directly separated, but affected multiple generations, as Benjamin's children and grandchildren grew up hearing stories about grandmother Rachel, whom they had never met, and about circumstances of Benjamin's separation from her that had shaped his entire life, despite occurring when he was only 7 years old. The intergenerational transmission of slavery's trauma, through family narratives preserving memories of separations, of cruelties, of injustices that legal systems refused to acknowledge or remedy, meant that slavery's effects persisted long after formal legal emancipation, and persisted long after last survivors of slavery died, because psychological and emotional wounds that slavery inflicted were transmitted across generations through mechanisms including direct discussion of traumatic experiences, through behavioral patterns reflecting unprocessed trauma, through family stories emphasizing resilience and survival, but also emphasizing suffering and injustice that descendants needed to remember, rather than allowing such memories to fade into comfortable historical amnesia that would deny reality of what enslaved people had endured. The question of whether Virginia's paralysis represented divine punishment or supernatural curse, or merely represented unfortunate medical coincidence that superstitious people interpreted as confirming their beliefs about spiritual forces capable of affecting physical reality, remained unresolved even after Benjamin's story became known, because people's interpretations reflected their prior commitments to rationalist frameworks, insisting that L phenomena possess naturalistic explanations, versus their commitments to spiritual frameworks, recognizing that reality includes dimensions transcending material causation that scientific methodologies can measure or verify. The significance of curse narrative within enslaved communities and within their descendants involved not primarily whether curse actually caused Virginia's paralysis through supernatural mechanisms, but rather involved what curse represented symbolically as assertion that enslaved people possessed power that masters could not control despite masters' legal authority and physical coercion, as assertion that justice would ultimately prevail even when human legal systems refused to provide accountability for crimes committed against enslaved people, and as assertion that enslaved people's humanity and enslaved people's moral agency persisted despite systematic attempts to reduce them to status of property lacking capacity for meaningful action beyond submission to master's authority. The memorial established at site where Magnolia Grove had operated, property that had been subdivided and developed during 20th century, but where a small historical marker now commemorated Rachel and Benjamin and other enslaved people whose lives had been shaped and often destroyed by slavery's brutal operations, included acknowledgement of Virginia's paralysis and included acknowledgement of debate about whether paralysis represented supernatural, a punishment or medical coincidence, but emphasized that regardless of causation, the timing of Virginia's paralysis exactly 1 week after Benjamin's sale created symbolic connection, reinforcing enslaved people's beliefs that justice existed even when legal systems denied such justice, and even when material circumstances suggested that master's power was absolute and could not be challenged effectively through any means available to people whose enslavement denied them access to legal remedies or political power that might have protected them against exploitation and cruelty that characterized slavery's operations throughout its existence in United States. The contemporary relevance of Virginia and Rachel and Benjamin's story extends to ongoing debates about historical memory, about reparations for slavery's harms, about how contemporary Americans should understand and acknowledge slavery's legacy that continues affecting African American communities through various mechanisms, including wealth gaps deriving from centuries of unpaid labor and systematic prevention of property accumulation, through ongoing racial discrimination in employment and housing and criminal justice systems, through intergenerational trauma, whose effects psychologists and historians are only beginning to understand adequately, and through structural racism that reproduces many aspects of racial hierarchy that slavery established despite formal legal equality that civil rights legislation provided, without addressing underlying economic and social structures maintaining racial inequality across generations. The debate about whether Virginia's attempted restitution through bequest to Benjamin represented adequate response to her crimes, or whether such belated gesture represented inadequate acknowledgement that did nothing to compensate Rachel for suffering she endured, or to compensate Benjamin for childhood trauma, and for lost opportunities resulting from separation parallels, contemporary debates about whether symbolic gestures acknowledging slavery wrongs represent sufficient response, or whether meaningful reparations require substantial transfers of resources, addressing accumulated disadvantages that slavery and subsequent systems of racial oppression created for African American communities whose contemporary circumstances cannot be understood adequately without recognizing how historical injustices produced present inequalities. The oral traditions preserved within Benjamin's family and within broader African American communities throughout South Carolina and throughout other states where slavery had operated included stories about Virginia's paralysis and about Rachel's curse, as examples demonstrating that enslaved people possessed spiritual power that white masters feared even while dismissing such power as superstition that ignorant people believed, included stories emphasizing that divine justice ultimately prevailed even when human justice failed, and included stories asserting that enslaved people's humanity and enslaved people's moral agency persisted despite systematic attempts to deny such humanity and such agency through legal frameworks treating them as property and through ideological frameworks insisting they lacked capacity for sophisticated thought or sophisticated emotion that would make them deserving of moral consideration that white people routinely extended to other white people, but systematically denied to black people regardless of those black people's actual capabilities or characters. The devastating true story of Virginia Thornwood, 32-year-old South Carolina heiress, who in October 1853 sold 7-year-old Benjamin away from his dying mother Rachel, despite Rachel's desperate pleas that Virginia allow her final days with her only remaining child, after Virginia had previously sold Rachel's husband Samuel and 2 older children Moses and Miriam, destroying Rachel's family and contributing to illness that would kill her. The days after Benjamin's sale, dying mother, who used her final breaths to pronounce curse declaring Virginia would never walk again and would spend rest of her life imprisoned in chair, unable to escape body that betrayed her, just as she had betrayed enslaved families through unnecessary cruelty, exceeding even slavery's normal brutality, represents one of most thoroughly documented cases of what enslaved people and their descendants believed represented supernatural justice. Delivered exactly as Rachel prophesied, when Virginia's legs failed exactly 1 week after Benjamin's sale, leaving her paralyzed below waist and confined to rocking chair for remaining 23 years until death in 1876. If this haunting account of how curse pronounced by dying enslaved mother apparently trapped cruel mistress in permanent paralysis, that physicians diagnosed as hysterical condition, but that enslaved witnesses insisted represented divine punishment for selling child away from dying mother. How Virginia's belated confession and attempted restitution through leaving $5 social bequest to Benjamin came too late to provide him resources during decades when such capital would have been transformative. How Benjamin's 1922 rediscovery at age 76 revealed lifetime shaped by childhood trauma of separation, whose emotional wounds never fully healed despite his success establishing family and building stable life in Birmingham. If this story has made you question whether Rachel's curse actually caused Virginia's paralysis through supernatural mechanisms, or whether psychological guilt and fear produced psychosomatic paralysis whose timing mere lie appeared to confirm curse's power, whether Virginia's 23 years of confinement represented adequate punishment for unnecessary cruelty she inflicted, or whether such suffering came nowhere close to compensating Rachel and Benjamin for trauma they endured. Whether attempted restitution through financial bequest represents meaningful acknowledgement of wrongdoing, or represents inadequate gesture that does nothing to address fundamental injustice of separation that destroyed family bonds slavery claimed to recognize but systematically violated. Then subscribe immediately. Like to spread stories challenging us to confront slavery's cruelty and to consider whether justice delayed or denied requires supernatural intervention when human legal systems refuse accountability. Comment where you're watching from and whether you believe curses possess real power or whether Virginia's paralysis represented medical coincidence whose timing enslaved people, interpreted as confirming beliefs about spiritual forces capable of punishing masters whose crimes human laws refuse to recognize. Share this with others who need to understand that Virginia's story demonstrates how slavery corrupted masters morally while destroying enslaved people's families physically and psychologically. That Benjamin's 70-year journey from traumatized 7-year-old, separated from dying mother, to elderly man, whose family oral traditions preserved memory of Rachel's curse and Virginia's paralysis, demonstrates intergenerational transmission of slavery's trauma across multiple generations, and that contemporary debates about whether symbolic acknowledgements of historical wrongs represent adequate response, or whether meaningful reparations require substantial resource transfers, parallel historical debates about whether Virginia's bequest represented adequate restitution or represented inadequate gesture that came too late to matter for people whose lives had been irreparably damaged by cruelty that legal systems refused to punish, and that only supernatural justice supposedly addressed through curse that trapped Virginia in rocking chair, where she spent final decades confronting consequences of choices she made when power was hers to wield without accountability, except to forces that rationalist frameworks insisted did not exist, but that enslaved people's experiences insisted were real and were capable of delivering justice that human systems denied.